Historical records indicate that the institution of imperial concubinage in Chinese dynastic courts was not a peripheral or informal arrangement, but a structured and regulated system embedded deeply within the political and social framework of imperial rule. Far from the romanticized portrayals often found in later literature and dramatizations, the lived reality of concubines was shaped by rigid hierarchies, codified expectations, and systems of control designed to preserve dynastic continuity and reinforce imperial authority. Surviving court documents and administrative records suggest that the selection of concubines followed procedures that varied across dynasties, but shared a consistent emphasis on order and classification. During periods such as the Han, Tang, and Qing dynasties, officials were tasked with identifying young women of suitable background, often from elite or respectable families. These women were presented to the court through formal selection processes that resembled bureaucratic examinations more than personal choice. Contemporary accounts describe how candidates were assessed for physical health, demeanor, and perceived moral character, all qualities believed to contribute to the stability of the imperial household. Once admitted into the palace, concubines entered a strictly tiered hierarchy. Legal codes of the period reveal clearly defined ranks, each associated with specific privileges, duties, and restrictions. At the top stood the empress, followed by various grades of consorts and concubines, sometimes numbering in the dozens or even hundreds. This hierarchy was not merely symbolic. It determined access to the emperor, allocation of resources, living arrangements, and influence within the court. Chroniclers noted that even minor differences in rank could significantly affect a woman's daily existence. The physical environment of the imperial palace further reinforced this system. Architectural layouts were designed to regulate movement and visibility, with inner quarters segregated from administrative and ceremonial spaces. Surviving descriptions of palace life emphasize the controlled nature of these environments, where access was mediated through layers of guards, eunuchs, and attendants. Concubines rarely moved freely within or beyond these confines. Historical evidence suggests that their interactions were closely monitored, not only to maintain order, but also to prevent unauthorized alliances or rivalries from escalating into instability. Eunuchs played a central role in enforcing this system of control. Contemporary accounts describe them as intermediaries between the emperor and the inner court, responsible for managing schedules, delivering communications, and overseeing the conduct of palace residents. Their position granted them significant influence, as they controlled access to the emperor and could shape the flow of information. In many cases, concubines depended on eunuchs to navigate the complexities of palace life, though this dependence also introduced vulnerabilities, as favoritism or corruption could alter outcomes in unpredictable ways. Daily life for concubines was characterized by routine and regulation. Surviving records suggest that their activities included participation in court rituals, maintenance of personal quarters, and adherence to prescribed etiquette. Education in literature, music, and ceremonial conduct was often provided, particularly for those of higher rank. However, this education served functional purposes within the court rather than personal development. It reinforced the roles concubines were expected to perform, including entertaining the emperor and contributing to the cultural refinement of the palace. The primary function of concubines within the imperial system was closely tied to reproduction. Dynastic stability depended on the production of male heirs, and concubines played a critical role in this process. Legal codes and court records indicate that the status of a concubine could change significantly if she bore a son. In some cases, the mother of a future emperor could rise to positions of considerable influence, even if she had originally entered the palace at a lower rank. However, this potential for advancement coexisted with intense competition and uncertainty. Infant mortality, political rivalries, and shifting imperial favor meant that outcomes were rarely predictable. Mechanisms of control extended beyond physical confinement and hierarchical ranking. Behavioral expectations were codified in detail, with strict penalties for transgressions. Surviving legal texts outline consequences for actions such as disrespect toward superiors, involvement in prohibited relationships, or attempts to influence court politics beyond prescribed limits. Punishments ranged from demotion and confinement to more severe measures, depending on the nature of the offense. These regulations function not only as disciplinary tools, but also as deterrents, reinforcing the boundaries within which concubines were expected to operate. At the same time, historical records suggest that concubines were not entirely passive participants in this system. Within the constraints imposed upon them, some individuals developed strategies to navigate the complexities of court life. Alliances with other concubines, relationships with influential eunuchs, and displays of cultural or intellectual skill could all serve as means of gaining favor or securing a more stable position. Chroniclers occasionally noted instances where such strategies led to significant shifts in status, though these outcomes were exceptional rather than typical. The emotional dimension of life within the imperial harem is less directly documented, but can be inferred from the structure and conditions described in surviving sources. The combination of isolation, competition, and dependence on imperial favor likely shaped a complex social environment. While some concubines may have experienced periods of relative stability or privilege, others faced prolonged uncertainty. The absence of personal autonomy, particularly in matters of marriage and family life, was a defining characteristic of their existence. Long-term consequences of this system extended beyond individual experiences to influence broader political dynamics. The presence of multiple potential heirs, each associated with different maternal backgrounds, often contributed to succession disputes. Historical accounts of several dynasties describe conflicts arising from rival factions within the court, sometimes centered around the status and influence of particular concubines and their offspring. These conflicts could have significant implications for governance, affecting decision-making processes and the stability of imperial rule. Over time, variations in the structure and management of concubinage reflected broader changes within Chinese political systems. Reforms introduced during different dynasties sought to regulate the size of the harem, standardize ranks, and limit opportunities for corruption or factionalism. For example, Qing dynasty regulations placed greater emphasis on documentation and oversight, reflecting an effort to align the inner court more closely with the bureaucratic principles governing the state. Despite these reforms, the fundamental characteristics of the system, hierarchy, control, and dependence on imperial authority, remained consistent. The treatment of imperial concubines, as reconstructed from historical records, reveals a system designed to serve the needs of the state while maintaining strict control over individual lives. It functioned as both a domestic arrangement and a political institution, integrating personal relationships into the broader framework of governance. Contemporary accounts and surviving documents do not present a uniform picture, but they consistently emphasize the structured and regulated nature of this environment. This convergence of personal and political dimensions underscores the complexity of imperial court life. The experiences of concubines cannot be understood solely in terms of individual narratives, but must be viewed within the context of the systems that defined and constrained them. Historical evidence suggests that these systems were both resilient and adaptive, capable of maintaining continuity across centuries while responding to changing political conditions. Surviving documents from successive dynasties suggest that the internal administration of the imperial harem evolved into a highly formalized extension of the state itself, governed by rules that mirrored the bureaucratic logic of imperial governance. Registers were maintained to document the identity, rank, and status of each concubine, along with records of promotions, demotions, births, and deaths. These administrative practices indicate that the harem was not an informal domestic space, but a monitored institution where information was systematically recorded and preserved. In some cases, archival materials reveal that even minor changes in status required formal approval, underscoring the extent to which authority over the inner court remained centralized. Legal codes of the period reveal that the emperor's household was subject to its own regulatory framework, distinct from but aligned with broader imperial law. These codes specified not only the hierarchical structure of concubines, but also the protocols governing their interaction with the emperor and with one another. Access to the emperor was scheduled and controlled, often determined by rank and ritual calendars rather than personal preference alone. Contemporary accounts describe systems in which designated knights were assigned to particular individuals, with records kept to ensure compliance and prevent disputes. This regulated access functioned as a mechanism to maintain order while also reinforcing the legitimacy of offspring through documented lineage. The issue of lineage was central to the political function of concubinage. Surviving genealogical records suggest that considerable effort was devoted to verifying the parentage of imperial children. Officials and attendants were tasked with observing and documenting relevant details, reflecting concerns about succession and legitimacy. In cases where doubts arose, investigations could be initiated, sometimes involving multiple layers of testimony and review. These practices highlight the degree to which reproduction within the imperial household was subject to oversight comparable to other matters of state importance. Chroniclers noted that the presence of multiple concubines created a complex network of interpersonal relationships, shaped by both cooperation and competition. While formal hierarchies defined official status, informal alliances could influence daily life within the palace. Historical evidence suggests that senior concubines often exercised authority over those of lower rank, overseeing aspects of conduct and discipline. At the same time, relationships between individuals could shift in response to changes in imperial favor or political circumstances. These dynamics were not merely personal. They intersected with broader patterns of influence within the court. The role of the empress within this system was particularly significant. Legal and ceremonial texts indicate that she functioned as the primary authority within the inner court, responsible for maintaining order and ensuring adherence to established norms. Her position allowed her to influence the distribution of resources, the enforcement of discipline, and in some cases, the advancement or suppression of particular individuals. However, surviving accounts also suggest that the authority of the empress was not absolute. It depended on her relationship with the emperor and her ability to navigate the complex environment of the court. Instances are recorded where empresses faced challenges from favored consorts or from factions aligned with rival interests. Eunuchs continued to serve as key intermediaries in this environment, and their influence expanded over time in certain dynasties. Administrative records indicate that they were responsible not only for logistical tasks, but also for maintaining internal security and reporting on activities within the harem. This role placed them in a position to shape perceptions and outcomes, particularly in situations involving accusations or disputes. Contemporary observers sometimes expressed concern about the concentration of power in the hands of eunuchs, noting that their access to both the inner and outer courts allowed them to act as conduits for information and influence. Efforts to regulate their authority appear in various legal reforms, though the effectiveness of these measures varied. The economic dimension of life within the harem is also evident in surviving sources. Concubines were allocated stipends, clothing, and other resources according to their rank. Inventories and financial records suggest that these allocations were carefully managed, reflecting the broader fiscal discipline of the imperial household. At the same time, disparities in access to resources could reinforce hierarchical distinctions and contribute to tensions within the group. Gifts from the emperor or from influential figures could further alter these dynamics, providing additional means through which favor was expressed and recognized. Health and medical care formed another aspect of regulated life within the palace. Records from court physicians indicate that concubines were subject to regular examinations, particularly in relation to reproductive health. These practices were linked to the emphasis on producing heirs, but they also reflect a broader concern with maintaining the well-being of individuals whose roles were considered essential to the functioning of the court. However, the quality and consistency of care likely varied, and the outcomes of illness or childbirth were influenced by factors that could not always be controlled. Disciplinary measures within the harem were governed by detailed regulations. Legal texts outline a range of penalties for violations of conduct, from minor infractions to more serious offenses. These penalties were often administered within the confines of the inner court, with the empress or designated officials overseeing the process. In some cases, records indicate that severe punishments could be imposed, particularly where actions were perceived to threaten the stability or reputation of the imperial household. The existence of such measures underscores the importance placed on maintaining order and conformity within a highly controlled environment. Historical records also provide insight into the limitations placed on communication between concubines and the outside world. Correspondence was restricted and subject to oversight, reducing opportunities for external influence or unauthorized exchange of information. Family visits were limited and often regulated by formal procedures. These restrictions contributed to the isolation of concubines, reinforcing their dependence on the structures of the court. At the same time, they served to protect the integrity of the imperial household by minimizing external interference. The intersection of concubinage with broader political developments becomes particularly evident in periods of transition or crisis. During times of succession uncertainty, the status of concubines and their children could become a focal point for competing factions. Historical accounts of several dynasties describe how alliances formed around potential heirs, with different groups within the court supporting rival claims. These conflicts were not always overt, but they could influence decision-making processes and contribute to instability. In some cases, the outcomes of such struggles had lasting effects on the direction of imperial policy. Efforts to manage these risks are reflected in various institutional practices. For example, some dynasties implemented rules limiting the influence of maternal relatives, seeking to prevent the emergence of powerful external factions. Others emphasized the role of senior officials in overseeing succession processes, attempting to balance the interests of different groups. Despite these measures, the inherent complexity of the system meant that tensions could not be entirely eliminated. Cultural and ideological frameworks also played a role in shaping the treatment of concubines. Confucian principles, as interpreted and applied within the imperial context, emphasized hierarchy, order, and the proper conduct of relationships. These principles were reflected in the expectations placed on concubines, as well as in the justification of the system itself. At the same time, variations in interpretation and practice across different periods indicate that ideology was adapted to meet the needs of changing political circumstances. Surviving literary and artistic works from the periods in question occasionally provide indirect perspectives on life within the harem, though these sources must be approached with caution due to their stylized nature. Nonetheless, they suggest that the institution of concubinage occupied a prominent place in the cultural imagination, reflecting both its significance within the court and its broader social implications. Taken together, these sources present a picture of an institution characterized by structure, regulation, and integration into the mechanisms of state power. The treatment of imperial concubines was shaped by a combination of legal codes, administrative practices, and cultural norms, all of which contributed to a system designed to maintain stability while serving the needs of the dynasty. Historical records from later dynasties suggest that as imperial systems matured, the regulation of the inner court became increasingly detailed, reflecting both administrative sophistication and heightened concern over political stability. The Qing dynasty, in particular, provides extensive archival material that illustrates how concubinage was embedded within a formalized bureaucratic structure. Palace memorials, personnel registers, and internal directives indicate that the imperial household was treated as a managed institution, with procedures resembling those of civil administration rather than private domestic life. Surviving documentation shows that appointments to concubine ranks were not static, but subject to periodic review. Promotions or demotions could occur in response to imperial favor, behavioral assessments, or broader political considerations. These adjustments were recorded in official registers, suggesting that status within the harem was continuously monitored and regulated. Contemporary accounts describe how such changes could have immediate effects on living conditions, including relocation to different quarters and alterations in access to resources or ceremonial participation. The spatial organization of the palace further reinforced these administrative distinctions. Archaeological evidence from sites such as the Forbidden City indicates a carefully segmented layout, with inner chambers reserved for higher-ranking consorts and more peripheral areas assigned to lower ranks and attendants. This spatial hierarchy was not merely symbolic. It structured daily movement, interaction, and visibility within the court. Access between different zones was controlled through gates and guarded passages, ensuring that movement reflected established rank. Within this environment, the role of ceremony played a significant function in reinforcing order. Court rituals, including seasonal festivals and imperial audiences, were governed by strict protocols. Concubines participated in these events according to rank, with seating, procession order, and attire all determined by established rules. Historical descriptions emphasize the precision of these arrangements, suggesting that ritual performance was a key mechanism through which hierarchy was publicly displayed and reinforced. The emotional and psychological dimensions of life within the inner court are not directly documented in official records, yet indirect evidence can be inferred from patterns of confinement, competition, and surveillance. The structured isolation of the palace environment, combined with the constant possibility of changes in favor, created conditions of uncertainty. While some concubines attained stable positions through sustained imperial attention or the birth of heirs, many others experienced fluctuating fortunes dependent on factors beyond their control. The absence of formal autonomy in matters of residence, communication, and family life was a defining feature of their existence. Legal records also indicate that the imperial system sought to prevent the formation of independent power bases within the harem. Restrictions on external communication, limits on contact with family members, and oversight of internal correspondence were designed to reduce the risk of factional alliances forming outside imperial control. In practice, however, historical accounts suggest that informal networks still emerged. Relationships among concubines, eunuchs, and attendants created channels of influence that operated alongside formal structures, sometimes reinforcing and sometimes circumventing official hierarchies. The role of motherhood within the concubinage system remained central to its political significance. Surviving genealogical and succession records demonstrate that the birth of imperial children, particularly sons, could dramatically alter the position of a concubine. However, this elevation was not guaranteed to be permanent or secure. In several documented cases, the status of a concubine rose following childbirth, only to decline later due to shifts in imperial favor or the rise of competing factions. This instability reflects the broader volatility of court politics, where personal relationships were deeply intertwined with governance. Medical texts from imperial archives provide additional insight into the conditions of concubines, particularly in relation to childbirth and reproductive health. Court physicians were assigned to monitor pregnancies and provide treatment, with detailed records kept of diagnoses and outcomes. These documents indicate a structured approach to medical care, though outcomes were still subject to the limitations of contemporary knowledge and conditions. High maternal and infant mortality rates, common in pre-modern societies, would have significantly shaped the lived experience of reproduction within the palace.